The Iron Game Chalk Talk podcast is brought to you by the following sponsors: EliteForm.com, IgnitionAPG.com, PlayUSA at PLAEUSA.com, and Sorinex Exercise Equipment at Sorinex.com. And now, the Iron Game Chalk Talk podcast. Welcome to Iron Game Chalk Talk with your host, Ron McKeefery.
Every time our athletes walk into this weight room, they're going to be pushed to the max.
Let's go! Everything you got!
On this podcast, hear Coach McKeefery straight talk about training, featuring the top strength and conditioning professionals from around the world. And now, here's your host, Ron McKeefery.
Hey guys, welcome back to Iron Game Chalk Talk. I'm your host, Ron McKeefery, and this episode number 137, the first episode of 2016, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate you guys joining me for another year of Iron Game Chalk Talk. Excited about our guest today, Derek Woodske. Derek is a very accomplished thrower from Canada. He was an NCAA All-American and national champion, and represented Team Canada on their national team and had a very storied career as an athlete. We get into a lot of different things with this episode. We talk about his journey, which including several setbacks and injuries and things along those lines. We talk about just kind of the mental approach as an athlete dealing with injuries, but then turn around and having that perspective when coaching. We talk about his high-end personal performance coaching, where he trained several athletes, but he also has some high-end, princesses and things like that, high-end clients from around the world. He's traveling all over, doing some really incredible things. And so we talk a lot about programming, his vertical integration model, leapfrog system, his priority system, and lots of really cool little nuggets here about training. And so I know you're really going to enjoy this episode. Before we do, we want to make sure we recognize our sponsors, and the sponsor for this show is Sorinex. But when this episode goes live, I'll be at the NCAA Coaches Conference. Most of you will as well, and so hopefully you go by, and please stop by Sorinex, Elite Form, Play, Ignition APG, and just let them, all of our sponsors, let them know how much you appreciate them. They've all four come back for another year. And again, the show is not possible without their support and making it free for you guys. Please just go by and thank them. But also, while you're there at the Sorinex booth, make sure you check out the center mass bells. Game changer in a lot of ways. It really opens up the kimono for lots of different options, with your kettlebell type exercises, and it's unjust to be able just to say it's kettlebell type exercises, because there are so many things you can do with it. So be sure to stop by their booth, check that out. Again, let those guys know just how much you appreciate them being a part of the show, and just can't say enough about Sorinex and the type of company they are, the type of people they are. So please step by and see them. I don't really want to spend a whole lot more time. I want to jump right into this episode, jump right into this year, and just real excited about what 2016 has in store. So sit back and enjoy, and we'll see you on the other side. All right, guys, excited to have Derek Woodske with us, the enigma himself. He's all over the world, and we finally were able to pin him down and get him on the show. But, man, I truly appreciate you coming on, brother.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's great to finally make it happen.
Yeah, man. We're talking off camera a little bit, but your journey is phenomenal. As a competitive world-class athlete yourself, and then what you've been able to do in the coaching world as well. Go a little bit into Reader's Digest version, kind of how you got into strength and conditioning, and then kind of what you're doing now.
Yeah, for sure. So strength and conditioning for me was almost an intrinsic passion from when I was a kid in British Columbia. I started lifting weights when I was about 14, but I always talk about it being the absolute reversed what I used to read in the muscle magazines. You used to read muscle magazines in the late 80s, early 90s, and some, athlete gets a knee injury, finds the weight room, becomes Mr. Olympia. For me, because athletics were so obscure in the town I lived in. I mean, we were a ski town in the mountains. So for me, I picked up a bodybuilding magazine. I started lifting weights. I started exercising, to the best of my ability, and that led me to become a better athlete. I was not recruited out of high school, etc., but I had developed a pretty good base in the weight room just from absorbing as much information, like the old Arnold Schwarzenegger Encyclopedia of Modern Bodybuilding, 508 pages of mystery to me. So that's how I got into the initial phases of strength and conditioning. I had had enough success in high school as a track and field athlete to get picked up by a junior college in Idaho. Mm-hmm. What I didn't know and what I could have never foreseen was that Bud Rasmussen, who was my coach back then, Brian Rasmussen. Well, Bud would go on to not only be one of the top throws coaches in the United States, but he would also go on to be the 2008 Olympic coach for the U.S. So he was just starting his career back then. I was just starting mine, and he got me onto that developmental road. From there, I was able to have, a good amount of success with Bud. I'd won some national championships for him. It was very good for me, and that bumped me finally from the JUCO to the D1 level. And so for me at the time, the best place to go for throws, in our opinion, was under a coach by the name of Larry Judge at Wyoming. So a bunch of us, from all over the country ended up in Wyoming. And that's how my relationship with strength and conditioning really sort of transcended, because I was now around a guy who was a former South Carolina coach, who had Kevin Mannon from South Carolina, 10 times All-American plus. All these guys came to Wyoming. So now, even though I'd had success in the weight room, I was sort of thrown into the lion's den of what real strength at the college level was. I'd never seen college kids bench 500 pounds before. That blew my mind. Right. So it was what accelerated that knowledge. Now I'd had at least 3 different systems of strength and conditioning, my own, Bud Rasmussen's, Larry Judge, and I started to really develop. In Wyoming, I had a host of injuries, though. I'll be very honest. Our system was a little high in the volume, slightly archaic. We were trying to make up 8 years of training in 4 years, which happens in college sometimes. And I ended up having a complete rupture of a patella tendon, breaking a foot, just a very obscure, very severe injuries. And I was able to come back from those during that 3-year period and still compete in college, but it completely changed my perspective of strength and conditioning, because now I had to go back and reevaluate, okay, I'm getting hurt at the end of my college career. I don't know if I'll continue in athletics, but I want to continue as an active, healthy person. So I had to break away from what I'd learned as structured strength and conditioning in terms of very, September's we're doing sets of 10, October's we're doing sets of 8. We peak in January.
Yeah, linear model, yeah, sure.
Yeah, very, very simplistic systems. And I had to break away from that because it wasn't allowing me to recover and get back to an active life, not even an athletic life, but an active life. So the year after college, I had to do all my own rehab. I was out of the system. I had my first job. I was coaching. And I, thank God to the internet, I was able to start to read and understand strength and conditioning from a host of different areas. Mm-hmm. My brother just started training under Judd Logan at Ashland, so now all of a sudden I had that as a conduit of information. Bert and I had developed a relationship through college sports, so I was connected to Sornex because we'd been, rivals in college,
Sure.
So I now had those friendships developing. And when that all started to develop, I realized that there was a much broader world of understanding where strength and conditioning wasn't just where I started with bodybuilding magazines, where I ended up Olympic lifting only. It was this amalgamation of all these things, where if you could take all these different tools and at different times of the year, different sequences of the year, you could actually, in a sense, rebuild a machine that was broken.
Sure.
And so for 2001 and 2, that's what I did, which got me in a situation where I could throw far enough again in the hammer for Team Canada that I started training again full time. So I went and trained with Judd Logan in Ashland. And in my opinion, I'd been successful in the weight room prior to Judd. I'd squatted 700 pounds as a 22-year-old. So I'd been very strong at a young age. Just with belts and a wrap, just old school, like before what we see nowadays on the internet everywhere.
Sure.
So I'd been very strong early, but I got hurt. And when I went and trained with Judd in the fall of 2002, I was there for 3 years, and even though it was post-reconstructed knee and a host of other issues, I was actually able to get back up to almost 700 pounds with Judd. But the way I describe it is, training with Judd, I was given the education to do it without injury and without it taking a huge draw on my nervous system. Mm-hmm. So now my training was supporting my sport instead of training and sport battling each other for dominance in my energy systems.
Right.
And I would say prior to working with Judd in Ashland, that was the issue that I saw a lot with strength and conditioning coaches, is they would have a real hard time balancing sport and accommodating strength. So in a sense, you start playing about 4 different sports in a given week. You got the sport of cleaning, the sport of snatching, the sport of hammer, and none of it was gelling. And so with Judd, I learned that. And that really started to transcend my understanding of strength and conditioning. And that led me into other opportunities. So like when you talk about lineage of coaching, I've been very fortunate. Because from Judd, I went to Buddy Morris, to Tom Oslinski, love him or hate him, Charles Poliquin, so I had all these guys that I was able to just literally sit down with for hours, not minutes, but hours of my life, when you're not even talking about strength and conditioning, you're talking about the weather, and a strength and conditioning tidbit falls on the table because there's no pressure to have a conversation. So I was able to work with all these people, and I realized that through probably that tenure process that people always are like, you can't say that stuff nowadays, but it's the truth. Everybody was right and everybody was wrong, myself included. And what I realized was, and I try to talk about this a lot when I got young coaches, if you put 10 of the top strength, internet or not, guys on the table and you go have a conversation, you're probably going to have 10 distinctly different conversations at the end of the day. But what I always tell people with strength and conditioning is even those 10 polarized opinions will overlap somewhere.
Absolutely.
And unless they're trying to sell you something, right? If someone's selling, they're never going to agree because they will tell you the sky's red just to be different.
Right.
But if it's an honest conversation, where that overlap occurs, if you're cognizant of that, that's what you want to pay attention to. Where do these 10 guys overlap? And that's the heart of the information that you really need to take notes on, because they can't disagree on fact.
Right. Yeah, no, I talk all the time about, I say when people ask me, what my philosophy is, I always tell them that I'm a principle-based strength coach, not a philosophy-based strength coach, and so the principle overload, you have how you apply overload with your athletes. I have how I apply overload with my athletes. We're not wrong,
Nope.
But we may differ, and I think being able to pull that from each other is fantastic, and that's where if you go into it and it's a learning opportunity that way, you can always learn a different way of doing stuff. Now, it might not be what's right for your athletes or in the timing of your program, but there's lots of ways to skin a cat, right? That's what it comes down to.
That's the absolute truth. It's, like I always tell people, I got to a 700-pound squat twice. The road I took was completely different, both times. But they both worked. They both got me to the goal. I was successful with both systems. Would I use one system a little more now through maybe some basic wisdom? Perhaps. But I'll be honest with you, when I was coaching college full-time as a throws coach, And the first system may have been a little more aggressive, a little more mechanical wear and tear. I've used that system since because I knew I had a shortened window with an athlete.
Right.
And when that window starts to dictate the job, and this is where it gets into a bit of a philosophical conversation. You have to be a good communicator of your ideas to your athlete, because sometimes you have to take that athlete to the ledge and be like, here's the deal. This ledge that we're standing on is going to determine your success. But if we go this direction or we go this direction, it's going to have maybe a slightly higher risk, but the reward may be slightly higher. And when you start to have those conversations with your athlete, that's where you're not by any means putting them into a situation that could be detrimental to them, but you have to explain to people that in certain sports, high levels of an elite performance, there is going to be a risk.
Right.
You can't play a game like football without replicating some of the stress demands that are necessary off the field. You can never, and I assume we're probably on the same page here, but I'm a big believer that you can't replicate the hammer throw in the weight room, but you can absolutely replicate the force requirements that may be necessary to throw a hammer 70 meters.
Sure.
So I can't do an exercise in the weight room that'll ever replicate that technical mastery. But I'll tell you what, snatching 318 pounds has a risk due to speed and mechanical components to it. It's quite high. Things can go high. But if I can do that movement in the weight room, it is going to have an eventual carryover to the sport of hammer throwing, for my world, that is necessary.
Right.
And it's those conversations that are in, and that was probably the biggest education I got over the years, was learning that risk to reward. Is this exercise going to make the difference? Is this exercise going to be the benefit to the athlete that we're looking for? And does the window of time that we have dictate what exercise we're going to end up having to use to get that success?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think I watched recently, there was a 60-minute interview with Ed Reed, I think, and they were talking about, just the injuries and the things that, that he went through in his body, and was the risk worth the reward, and he came from poverty in West Virginia, I think, and then, now he's living in this mansion, and he's like, man, I'd go back absolutely knowing everything that I went through, I'd absolutely go back and do it all over again. And, I think what you said, is something I always talk about with our coaches as well, is that everything works, but there's a cost and a benefit, and just knowing what the costs are and what the benefits are and whether or not they outweigh each other. And if you're working with individual athletes, or when you're working with individual athletes, having those real conversations that say, hey, put 700 pounds on your back, is, that's not, your body's not made for that, but, if you want to generate the amount of force that you need to do to reach your goal, then you're going to have to put 700 pounds on your back at some point, but I think, I've read a lot of the articles that you've written, and, and you've mentioned it a couple of times about, the plan, and these different plans. And that's what it is. It's not so much necessarily a philosophy, but it's plans, And you talked a couple of times about, like a vertical integration and a priority kind of 1 to 4 system. Kind of elaborate on those two things, would you?
Yeah. So when I started working with athletes in particular, and I think it carries over even to people that are looking for body composition and fitness-based stuff, but you have to be a little more structured when you're trying to get to an end goal of performance. And so what I found when I was taking an athlete from 0 to 100 on a scale is I would set up my training, and I didn't start this initially. This came over time through the amalgamation of systems, but Thomas Linsky, when I was with him in the Cleveland Browns, introduced me for the first time to the concept of vertical integration and Charlie Francis's stuff. And that was the first time that I started to be like, okay, this is a system that my system that I'm playing with actually starts to gel with. And it started to make sense to me. I'm like, okay, there's a name for what I'm trying to figure out. And so it sped up my strength and conditioning education because now I could start to pull from Charlie Francis. And
very quickly, just define vertical
Yep.
integration real quick.
So, in a vertical integration is the way that I understood it, is the idea that you can train all systems simultaneously depending on where you're at in the season. You put priority on certain areas, but you never completely remove one stimulus from the system. So, for example, if in the early off season of an athlete's training, they need a lot of focus because they're coming back from an ACL or maybe they had some knee stuff, and they're doing a lot of structural movement stuff for, say, the quadriceps, or more importantly, maybe they're training the different aspects of the hamstring to stabilize the knee rotationally. So that's going to take priority in the system. Say, if you're peaking in July, that's going to take priority in September. But as the season progresses along, you're going to start to move what was once priority in the workout, so let's call that A. You're going to start to move that down towards the bottom of the workout and introduce new priorities. So we know that from a neurological standpoint, in my opinion, you want to put the most neurologically demanding stuff first in the system. And what people don't understand is neurologically demanding, and I don't want to get too heavy in this, but it's really important. Neurologically demanding, everyone always assumes, well, a clean is more neurologically demanding than a step up, which is correct in a healthy client. Mm-hmm. Now, what people always have a tendency to overshoot is if somebody's coming back from an ACL, doing a single leg stork stance in bare feet on a piece of foam could be the most neurologically demanding thing they can do at that time.
Great.
So that's going to be priority one for the day. That's the hardest thing they're going to do that day because they're weak and they're injured or they're coming off the injury. But as that progresses, that type of movement or that stimulus will become easier. And as it becomes easier to the athlete and new, more complex stimuluses are added to the training, they will start to come in as the A and B series, and those movements like leg curls or stork stances or single leg pistol squats may start to drop down in the workout. So say in a 60-minute window, in the first 15 minutes of that session, they started at single leg isometrics. But by week 12 or week 14, now they may be doing, say, a trap bar deadlift for their A exercise. That's a bilateral movement. They're nice and stable. They're nice and strong. B will be a little less neurologically demanding. C will be a different priority again. That's a little less demanding. But they may still have a taste of that structural movement that they needed for that injury in the workout, but it may be in the last block for the day, the last 5 to 10 minutes, maybe 1 to 2 sets. They're still getting a stimulus or a taste of that movement, but it's no longer priority.
Right.
And then as that progresses, by the time you get to the end of the season, if everything has gone really well, you may have 3 priorities that work out: clean, squat, plyometric, right? And the shot putter's getting ready for the Olympic Games. And they're like, yeah, but there's no more structural balance left. And it's like, sport takes precedent, okay? Right. You hang on to those reins as you peak that athlete, and you hopefully nothing falls off, no injuries occur. And then at the end of the season, you reevaluate and you reset your pyramid, and you look at what needs to become off-season priority 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so what I've always done is I've always taken my A priority, B priority, C priority, in a sense linearly progress them along the timeline while introducing new variables. So before the athlete is ready to do Olympic lifts, for example, they may do deadlift progressions in that priority A phase. Now, they may not be back squatting in that training cycle. So they're doing deadlifts, and then they're doing maybe some bilateral movements for the lower or unilateral movements for the lower to support what they're doing with that A series. But as that progresses along and you start to introduce more dynamic movement, so the deadlift becomes a clean pull becomes a clean high pull becomes an Olympic lift, and someone that has a long linear progressive pattern, as that happens, the B series also becomes more complex. So by the time that you transfer from, say, deadlifts to clean pulls, now all of a sudden that B series, which was supportive to deadlifts, maybe low back work or something, now that can become a little more dynamic as well, and that's progressed up to a squat.
Right.
So the neurodynamic is, to me, is always speed based. So the clean pull takes priority. The squats, and it can be a bit of it depends on the athlete, but I can go back and forth on this. But the squat becomes the B phase. Sometimes it's an A phase, depending on how strong the athlete is. But that's what happens. And when I set up my program, I've always pretty much used that system of just introducing new variable through the CNS demand and decreasing CNS demand as you get to the end of the workout.
Sure.
So when you're in minutes 50 through 60, say for in a hypothetical situation, that movement pattern will always be supportive to the workout, supportive to the end goal, neurologically very undemanding. But it may be mechanically extremely demanding.
Absolutely.
So I'm a big believer that same with the vertical integration, which Milo taught me, is you can maintain a stimulus just by keeping it in the system. So if I have a shot putter that needs to maintain CNS demand or an O-lineman, for example, but they need to keep muscle mass, I will have maybe a predominantly CNS workout that goes through 30 to 40 minutes of CNS demand, but we may still touch on some mechanical work or some hypertrophy work at the end to maintain that, elite size that they need for the sport, for example. Or if I got an athlete that has chronic hamstring issue or chronic something, who knows, they may always have some work for those hamstrings at the end. If I have an athlete, because like I was telling you, I've had 7 surgeries on my leg. Some of this I learned from this process. So if I have an athlete that has ACL reconstruction or patellar tendon reconstruction, and the right VMO, get really specific, but the right VMO always atrophies when you take volume away because it's just dysfunctional. Could be neurological, could be mechanical. Who cares? It's dysfunctional.
Right.
We would always maybe that guy finishes with TKEs for the first 40 weeks of the year, and then it's not until he's making that true transition to peaking for that USAs where they get away with it, and you, like I say, you just hang on until you finish up.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I've always fought this, as a coach, where, especially with coaching football. I mean, everything exists on a continuum, and you never segment out. Yeah. When do you not use your upper body in football? When do you not use your lower body? When are you not explosive? Or with a running back, I want my defensive back to be as big as I could possibly get them, and I want my offensive lineman to be as fast as I possibly can get them. And so those principles, they don't change across the board. And so you're having to hit those. Now, you're right. I mean, my defensive back might be doing double-A plyo jumps versus my offensive lineman might be doing a 12-inch box jump,
Right.
But having that in kind of a system, I think makes complete sense. I mean, you run the gamut. You work with elite level athletes that are prepping for, Olympics, and you work with a princess over in Saudi Arabia. How do you use that system with both different populations and keep them bought in?
Yeah, see, that's a good question. Now, I always prelude this because I'm very honest about it. And I know that you'll agree, having coached for as long as you have to be a phenomenal communicator of your belief system. And Judd Logan said this to me once, and it stuck with me like glue. The athlete that has complete faith in a bad program will have more success than an athlete that has no faith in a good program.
Agreed. Yeah.
And and a lot of people get all bent out of shape, and they're like, and it's like, no, it's simple. You have to accept sociology. You have to accept the psychology of the athlete. People are people. And what I always do is when I'm taking on a new client, so say if I'm working with Kurt Roberts, for example, we've been going together now for a couple of years at this, and our first year was tremendous. He goes to Indoor Worlds, he places second at USA's, throws over 70 feet of both. We peaked on the money. Last year did not go well for us. We had, at the start of the season, we had a freak injury. He lost the use of his left leg. And then people don't think, they don't know these things. They just see a downward performance.
Sure.
So we had to reevaluate everything. And the same type of reevaluation that I would use with Kurt as an Olympic hopeful, or my athlete that I train in Saudi Arabia, who's, like you say, the opposite end of that spectrum. She is an elite female, in my opinion, an elite female physically, but she's not training for the Olympic Games.
Right.
She's training for goals that are personal. But the system is the same. Now, how does that change? Okay, so say with someone like Kurt, who is a shot putter, we're going to be training very much in a way that is related to the sport of shot put. But now we're training in a way that's related to severe herniation of a disc in his back. Okay,
Right.
so we've had some other changes.
Sure.
But the structure of the training, the priority goal for him, or what I would refer to as point A of each workout, is to make him more powerful. He needs to throw a shot put further. And, you know, as a 290-pound guy, he's been very successful. He's a 54-inch box jump, so it's going in the right direction. Now, how does that change with, say, my client in Saudi Arabia? Well, she also wants to be extremely strong, which is nice from my standpoint. It makes it fun for me. But we have secondary goals. She wants to be extremely fit. And so for her, and this is where you have to be, like we say, use the tools. Don't buy into the dogma of one system. We have to integrate huge amounts of not only metabolic work for her because of her goals, but we also have to be ready to integrate steady-state aerobic work.
Right.
Now, in the strength and conditioning world that we're from, we don't think much about that. We're like, yeah, steady state, that makes sense. That's the baseline energy system that everything runs from. But people that are transitioning from the fitness world, when you tell them that we need to do steady state, the current trend for the last 5 years is you've basically just insulted them to their face.
Right.
Because they think, oh, it's gonna break my gains, like this whole mentality. And it's like, they don't understand because they don't actually come from a scientific knowledge background of how physiology works. Right. And how there's a time and place for all variables. So once you establish that, it's just a matter of making priority changes. So my client in Saudi Arabia, we'll have sessions where, we'll work up to, like this week, I was really stoked because she tripled 73K in the front squat, which is well over body weight, everything's going well. But what people don't understand is we start every one of those sessions that we do, strength-based sessions, with a metabolic-based row sprint, ski erg, assault bike, something that is going to be maybe a 1-to-3 or a 1-to-5 work-to-rest ratio. Right. But for her, because of what we're trying to achieve, and this took me, I'll be very honest, a year to figure out, we have a better neurological activation with her from doing this 10 to 15 minute dynamic warm-up equivalent, even though it's probably at a slightly higher heart rate variability than even a dynamic might be for another athlete. But what we do is when we get heart rate variability up for a brief moment to about 90%, 85-90% for her, and I mean brief, like we probably only get into that range about 3 to 5 minutes. Once we're done with that, and then we go into some hip mobility, her CNS is absolutely on fire for that workout. Now, sometimes that won't work for a guy. For her, or for people in general, not to be,
right,
know what I mean. So, work with an athlete. So, with her, it works excellent. For me, it also worked really well. I don't know why I didn't use it with her sooner. Now, with Kurt, we have a slightly different system. He's got all that muscle mass. He's a huge dude. We can't do an AMRAP or whatever people call these things nowadays, right? We can't do a minute on the minute for 10 minutes to get him ready for a workout. Just can't.
Yeah,
he's huge, right?
No doubt.
He'd be the color of a tomato laying on the ground, right?
No
So too much muscle mass. So with him, the dynamic warm-up is more traditional. It's more movement-based. Heart rate probably gets up to 75%. He's probably starting to break a sweat. And then the neurological demand of his work sets will spike his heart rate for the next few works. If he's going to be squatting 450 for 5, he's going to hit that 90% heart rate for about 10 seconds. Right? So it's a different animal. But the priority just has to mix and match to that individual. Now, having having come from a team sport and an individual sport-based system, it's extremely difficult to find that perfect blend, right? It's like putting the perfect amount of cream in coffee when you're trying to do that with 50 guys at a time.
Yeah, 105 football players, and they all play different positions, and they all have different maturation levels. That's always fun, right?
You wonder, and this, I'll tell you a tidbit, and she won't mind if I tell you this. One of my closest friends is a member of Team Canada's soccer. So she was on the bronze team, bronze medal team in the UK. So I got to work with her for the summer, and she was telling me a crazy story. So they do GPS tracking of heart rate for the women's team during matches. Now, she played all 540 minutes of the Olympics in 2008, so she really had a good Olympic year. Now, here's what's interesting. She has a ton of muscle mass for a women's soccer player, a ton of muscle mass. When they did, because they don't do projected heart rate, they find heart rate max in a lab, and then they their percentage off of that. So she had a match where she stayed at 90% of heart rate max for 60 minutes.
Wow.
I had never heard of that before. I knew that, like, she always laughs, she's like, she goes, I'm a big, bigger, muscular female soccer player. She goes, I hit the red like 5 minutes after I started warming up.
Right.
And so, and up until that point, if I saw an athlete that had that heart rate response, I'd start like pulling all these variables and like backing off here, changing this. It's just how she is. She's the only one on the team that does it, and she can maintain it because she trained to that level of performance.
Right.
Right. And that's the specificity that's hard to find with team sports.
Right.
Because you would start to look at that situation and it's like, I wonder if we need to do something different, like pull her out of this drill or do something. Nah, man, just let her roll. She'll adapt.
Yeah, that's where when you get into all that technology, I mean, it's not the same for every person, and
sure
the demands of the sport don't change, and so I mean, they have to be able to perform their job regardless of how their body's responding to it. We've dealt with that quite a bit, but you mentioned something earlier.
Yeah.
That I want to really dig into a little bit is. You talked about all the injuries and how you've changed based on, systems and things along those lines. But, you mentioned restoration, and how, the mechanical demands, they really haven't changed a whole lot in lots of years, but really where people are making the difference is in restoration. I mean, what are some general thoughts and some general recommendations on, what, we should be doing in those areas?
It's one of my favorite areas to talk about because when we look at the mechanical demand on the body, everybody's trying to sell a new gimmick, but basically elbow flexion's been elbow flexion since we were created.
That's right.
So and there's a huge boom right now. People have started to integrate bands and now, not in the accommodated resistance way. Like we understand it, but like strapping bands in weird positions or doing RDLs and pushing your hips against bands while holding a barbell.
Right.
Okay. When I see that sort of stuff, a part of me steps back and goes, "Oh, that's creative. Let me take a look."
Right.
But another part of me steps back and it's like, okay, you're doing an RDL with 135 pounds. Well, you have two different tension bands pulling two different directions to try to activate your glutes. Okay, we're getting too far away from the premise. The premise is if you put enough load, the mechanical stress on the body will take care of the rest, right? If you want to develop your glutes and hamstrings, try getting as strong as humanly possible for that individual.
Right.
That hasn't changed, but what has changed, and this is why I think they're getting away with it. When you look at restoration, in my opinion, is the fundamental difference between two cloned athletes, one making the Olympics and one not. So in a perfect scenario, say we could build two people in a laboratory and we gave them the exact same program for the next 4 years. The athlete that can shorten the time between training sessions will have the best opportunity to be the Olympic champion out of the two, if they're both equal. So that, and I know it's taboo for some, but I don't care. That's why anabolic steroids were so effective and still remain to be an issue in sport. It's not that they take that person and magically put on all this muscle mass or make them strong. What people, in the bodybuilding world likes to confuse us with this because we don't see it as it happens. What it actually does is we're looking at the ability to accelerate restoration.
Yep.
So athlete B goes on some sort of program that accelerates restoration. They're able to experience the stimulus of let's call it sprinting, or the stimulus of downhill skiing, because it's not just track and field that has these issues. But you start to see the recovery and stimulus happen, say, every 36 hours instead of every 72. Now, when you add that up over the course of 4 years,
no question,
a lot of training sessions being achieved. And we see these articles coming up where, everybody's, I train legs 4 days a week. I'll be honest with you, I hope this doesn't get me into trouble, but I don't care. If I see an athlete that is doing huge volume on the internet, doing big cleans, big snatches, maybe they're CrossFit, maybe they're not, doesn't matter, but they never compete at USA's. They never go to USA weightlifting, but they got the best 2-event total right now on the internet.
Right, yeah.
And they're squatting 6 times a week, but they refuse to go to USA weightlifting championships. They're probably on the gear, okay? I mean, it's just you have to step back and use a logical thought process. So restoration is the difference maker. Now, where I like to expand that a little bit, okay? So say we get past the elephant in the room, which is chemical restoration using anabolics, peptides, things like this to physiologically accelerate recovery. And that's what we're seeing now bombarding the internet, because we're seeing guys staying at sub 6% year round, girls where you can see abs in their abs, it's nuts, right? So, okay, whatever, that's their world. Now, how do we deal with restoration in the real world of sports performance? And I probably take some heat for this, but the real world of sports performance is the world in which you have to program based on the genetic variables of the individual. Now, I'm not going to sit here and ignorantly say that there isn't, experimentation in sport. We're not fools, but people don't realize the vast majority of sport athletes are actually not on the gear.
Right.
Like, everyone wants to think they are because it makes them sleep better at night. Like,
it's why so much better.
Yeah. 650 as a part-time weightlifter because he's also playing football. He's got to be on the gear.
Right.
No, my friend, Bobby is the 1% that you just unfortunately don't fall into.
Right.
And that, I hate to admit it, in my experience in pro sports was the majority, not the minority.
Yeah, you're right.
And people hate to hear it, but it's true. There's less drugs in sports than people want to believe.
Agreed.
So anyway, soapbox off. With restoration, once we look at that variable, people have to start to look at it as a much more broad spectrum. When you're looking at restoration, it not only happens on the biological cellular level, but it has to happen all the way through the CNS to the mechanical stress level. So I'm a big believer with restoration. If you're trying to accelerate or decrease time between training sessions, from the mechanical stress level, athletes have to start investing in returning the body to what I call as point zero. Getting the tension out of the torn tissue, bringing down inflammation, returning muscle to resting length. Now you can do that through modalities from stretching through to therapy to who knows what, but it has to be done.
Right.
You have to unwind that muscle. You have to get the tissue back to a healthy, non-tonus state. You have to get it back to a base level where it can do work again. A lot of people don't realize, but the majority of athletes that get injured or fail to see improvement, it's because their muscle and the CNS stays too sympathetic during the off training periods.
Right.
You have to get parasympathetic mechanically as well as neurologically. You have to get that body to relax. So that's going to decrease time between training sessions, and it's going to massively upregulate restoration. So now maybe that clean athlete's going to get those 3 hard squat sessions a week in and be able to keep going. But once you take it from there, you have to take it a little more internal, and you do have to start to look at things like, how is nutrition playing with mechanical restoration? How is nutrition playing into controlling of inflammation variables? So we know we need some inflammation to trigger the addition of new muscle mass over time,
Right.
and that's why we do train. But you have to get that inflammation under control really quickly.
Right.
And it's going to shorten the time between sessions. But then you also have to look at hormonal. So then you have to start looking at testosterone-cortisol relationships. And that's where it all starts to become very much in what am I ingesting, how am I spending my downtime, and am I getting enough recovery psychologically to allow cortisol to drop, testosterone to return baseline or above, and help this mechanical damage occur. So I think if you want to see a huge improvement in restoration, performance in athletes as a whole, there has to be a huge movement towards educating the athlete in nutritional protocol. Supplementation to some degree, a lot of people are on the fence about that, but supplementation does make a difference because we're trying to optimize performance. We're not trying to get the baseline.
Right.
Of all people, Joe Rogan made a funny statement one time. He said, listen, I don't take supplements because I don't eat vegetables. It was along those lines. He's like, everyone tells me, you can get everything you need from the food you eat. And he's like, yeah, of course I can get everything from the food I eat, but I'm trying to optimize my performance.
Right.
I'm not trying to get a base level of performance. And so when you're looking at restoration, that's where supplementation comes in. You're trying to get that extra 2 to 3% after you've done everything else correctly. Now, if you've got a guy that hasn't eaten breakfast in 7 years, all the supplements in the world may be a little bit of a plugging a dam with one too few fingers,
Right.
That can be a bit of an issue. But if you can get someone's got a good basic nutrition plan, we're trying to optimize. And supplements will absolutely accelerate restoration.
Right.
That's for sure. We can't deny that. It's and that's a big one. And now with some new things that we're looking at, like with cryotherapies coming into play, the Germans have been using it for years, the cryotherapies with their athletes. We know that ice baths have a little bit of a question mark in terms of P receptors and maybe just releasing endorphin. But the cryo centers from what we can tell, are affecting the body a lot differently. So there is that restoration world out there.
Right.
And I think that every athlete that wants to maximize it, and by no means will I get in trouble by saying this, but when I was at the Browns, a hidden secret that blew me away is we had a running back in 2007. I'll let people figure it out. But he invested probably in the neighborhood of $200,000 a year into his own restoration.
Yeah.
Okay? Because the way that he explained it to the young guys is he was the corporation of such and such, and that he needed to make an investment each year into keeping that corporation alive.
Yeah.
And at his age, I'll tell you what, it was incredible. Now, he had doctors that would come in and treat injuries and do all these things and soft tissue work and ART, and he had all this stuff going on. But that was his investment to shorten the window of 7 days.
Right. Right.
And
you think about Bill Romanowski and you could go on James Harrison, all these guys that invest in that. I couldn't agree with you more. And you talk about, especially, you compare it to most of the people that are listening to this are in some sort of, sanctioned type of environment to where everybody's, mechanical time is predetermined. Everybody's going to train. Everybody's going to, you got 8 hours in the off season, you got 20 hours in the in season or whatever it is. Where you can make the most competitive advantage is in restoration and nutrition and, all these variables that, not every one of my athletes are going home and eating correctly. Not every one of them are getting 8 hours of sleep. Not every one of them are, and so you want to make a difference in your team. It's being an effective communicator, like you said early on, but really showing them the value in restoration. So I couldn't agree with you more, man. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but we could talk for hours about this stuff. We always end the show with some resources. Give me the best piece of coaching advice you've ever received.
I would say probably for me, the best piece of coaching or the best pieces of coaching advice have still come from Judd. With all the people I've met, he has an ability to take the complicated and make it not simple, believable.
Right.
And there's a huge difference between that. Everybody's trying to simplify shit. Can I say that?
That's fine.
Everybody's trying to simplify it. And it's, I disagree. Like, I disagree adamantly. My entire athletic life was not simple. I overcame every single possible shitty situation to still have success. The best piece of coaching advice I can give is learn how to make difficult things believable. If you can get people to understand that it's going to be hard, it's going to be shitty, it's going to be a hands and knees, crawl on your belly experience to have success, they will find a way to be successful.
Right. No, I could agree with you more on that. That's just it. I mean, most athletes think it's just going to be handed to them, because that's what we've reinforced as a society through their pee-wee and their little league and their high school. And, they get to where everybody, like you said, you mentioned genetic ability, where everybody's very similar. You get to the NFL where, they're all good. Every single one of them are good,
Superstars, right?
Yeah.
And that one's a big one for me. It's, do not downplay the complexity of skills.
Yep.
It's accept them for what they are and master them. Generations before us, when you think of the art of the samurai and somebody that would spend 30 years just learning how to perfectly draw a bow. And now we've gotten to the point in our society where we're trying to simplify the game of football so that people can understand and play it better.
Right.
You can't simplify that because you can't simplify, this is going to sound weird to say, but you can't simplify a human being's intent to tear your ass in half.
Yeah, you're right.
You can't simplify that. That is so complex in nature that the only thing you can do is get really good at preventing it to happen.
Yeah, that's great.
I'm
going to steal that one from you, buddy. That one's going down for sure. I love that. What about some resources? What's a great book, app, and website recommendation?
I'm a little bit all over the road with that. We both agree. I'm a huge Juggernaut fan.
Yeah.
It's that one's a big one for me that I like to read. I'm a huge Elite FTS guy. I like to read their stuff all the way back because, to me, I like these websites. Juggernaut's a little bit newer, of course, but I like these websites where I can go back and I can look at coaching articles that are going back a decade now, where we're getting a little bit of and this doesn't make sense to some people, but I think it will for some. You want to be able to get a hold of sources that are not influenced solely by social media.
Right.
So social media is amazing, but you want to read from coaches that were writing with the intent to give information, not with the intent to get hits or shares.
Agreed.
Because the information was different back then. So I'm a big believer that go back and read the archives.
Yeah.
That stuff's really important for people to pay some attention to, because if you're only getting like 2010 and beyond, we were starting to see hit-based information, so it had a bit of an energy to it, which some of it's fantastic, don't get me wrong, but you want to go back archives. There is a couple books from Christian Thibodeau. I always forget the one off the top of my head because the name is about 18 words long, but I know that Thomas Linsky had written a foreword for it back in 2007.
Okay.
It'll be easy for people to find. It's like the applied theory of strength and conditioning or something of that nature. But I got to read it when I was working with Tommy. The book is excellent. I think it's a very concise, clear way of getting information. And some of the concepts people talk about, it's a good one. I'm terrible that I can't remember the name, but to be honest with it, I wrote it as acronym.
I'll have it in the show notes for sure.
Yeah, and then the other one that I think people really should just take a read, and I read it and I really enjoyed it. I do like Triphasic Periodization by Cal Dietz.
Yeah.
I enjoy it. I really enjoyed that. I was fortunate enough to get to read it. And then I know that a lot of people have bootlegged it, but if I could just say one recommendation, if you have a bootlegged version of Jim Wendler's stuff.
Yeah.
Can you just go buy a version?
No doubt.
Right?
No doubt.
I did the same thing. You know, someone sent me, and I'll be honest, someone sent me a bootleg version when it first came out, and I remember thinking, this is excellent. I really enjoyed it, and I went and bought it.
Yeah.
You know, so yes, you know, so I like that as well.
I hear you, man.
I really enjoyed his book when it came out, and you know, so just like basic premise stuff. Now, books that I recommend, because being a therapist, buy Touch for Health for curiosity's sake, to expand your ideas outside of just pure strength and conditioning principles. Supple Leopard is great.
Yeah.
I think that's a great book. You need to introduce some of these what ifs. You don't have to get into the, you know, aura feeling fluffy stuff to be successful in restoration, but you definitely have to see where it comes from and start to experiment a little bit with that, because there's some cool stuff out there that we don't really understand.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. Well, man, this has been fun, man. It really has. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I took 3 pages of notes here, so I know everybody will get a lot out of it. Your website is great as well, mg2u.com.
Yeah, to
and we'll put that up.
And if and if they want, if they just go to my Instagram, which is my name, what people don't realize is I probably put up about 3 micro blogs a week on my Instagram.
Okay, cool.
It's the easiest way for me to do it while I'm traveling. Some are about training, some are about philosophies of training and life, and so I use both now, and I hate to admit it, I've become an Instagram guy.
Isn't that crazy, man? I tell a story, you know, in my book that you know, if back in the day, if you would have told me that you tweeted me or something, I would have punched you in the face, you know.
Yeah.
But that's the way of the world now, right? I mean, you find whatever medium works best for you. So for you, it's Instagram. For me, it's probably Twitter. You know, whatever it is, and but it could be a great aggregator of information. And,
it's incredible.
You know, and so I couldn't agree with you more. And so we'll put Instagram down as your app there. But man, hopefully, like I told you on the front end, you know, this is the start of a relationship, man, a friendship, and I really appreciate you coming on, sharing with everybody, and taking the time, buddy. Thanks so much.
Awesome. I couldn't be happier to have been asked.
That's it for this episode of Iron Game Chalk Talk. Thanks to this week's guest as well as our sponsors for bringing this episode to you for free. Make sure to check out ronmckeefery.com, where you can join our mailing list, find the show notes, including all the links and resources mentioned, and information about Coach McKeefery's other products. While you are there, please join Coach McKeefery in the comments section thanking our guest for sharing. If you haven't subscribed to Iron Game Chalk Talk on YouTube or iTunes yet, make sure to do so. Comments, ratings, and reviews are always welcome. Coach McKeefery can be found on Twitter at @RMcKeefery, on Facebook and YouTube at /Ron.McKeefery. That's it for this week. Be sure to check back next week for another great episode of Iron Game Chalk Talk.